Welcome to an introduction to green economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. In this podcast, we are going to look at electricity generation and try and present information that uses both emission of carbon dioxide and kilowatt hours to make measurements. The intention is to present information for you to discuss. We will start with the generation of electricity. We have defined our units as being the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity being produced for the grid. These figures will vary quite widely according to how electricity is produced, and this is where we try and present the figures in a meaningful way. The cost of electricity, in terms of carbon emission, is now measured over the lifetime of the power station. This makes it more realistic when we are trying to compare coal, nuclear, wind, oil and so on for producing electricity. There is one degree of uncertainty. The lifetime of a power station may be altered by technology, but we are assuming that the power station is going to operate for all of its expected life. Why are these measurements made? For anyone old enough to have lived through the 1950s and seen the skies darken from emissions from industry and homes from burning coal, well, there is no need to be reminded that smoke was a major pollutant. The skies are no longer darkened in this way, at least not in most developed countries, but the fuels are still used and they still emit carbon dioxide. What has made scientists and politicians so interested in levels of carbon dioxide emission? Levels of carbon dioxide have varied in the past, particularly during the glacial and interglacial periods. The warmer interglacial periods showing the higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The lower levels, around 180 parts per million, are the coldest glaciated periods. Typically, the warmer period has been within a level of around 280 to 300 parts per million. The current level is around 393 parts per million, having risen by around 100 parts per million over the last 100 years. The United States makes regular measurements of carbon dioxide levels. The graph shows the changes over the last 50 years. It is clear there has been a large rise during this time. How does this compare with the geological records? You should note the large estimates of uncertainty when we try and go back for any length of time. When we go back to the ice ages, we can measure the CO2 bubbles in the ice. There is no such measurement when we go back several million years. In fact, the most accurate historical method records we have only go back around 630,000 years, but they do show current levels are higher than at any time during this period. Most measurement comes from the Vostok ice core. So why the concern, and why are we spending time on the issue here? The average global temperature is increasing. Average levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are increasing, and most of that increase appears to be from anthropogenic activity. Fossil fuel combustion of coal, oil and gas accounts for emissions of 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. Scientists believe that continuing rising in global temperatures will affect a large number of activities. These effects are discussed in another podcast. We are simply interested in the reduction of carbon dioxide levels now accepted as desirable by all countries, including the USA and China. Very recent studies have indicated that the rise in carbon dioxide levels precedes the rise in temperature, which changes what some scientists had previously believed from the ice core studies. This would put a finger on carbon dioxide levels as a probable cause of the temperature rise. Let us return to electricity production. We can see that in 2005, over 70% of electricity generated in the USA came as a result of combustion of fossil fuels. The situation in the United Kingdom is almost the same. Over 70% of electricity comes from the combustion of fossil fuels. Currently, the UK imports both some coal and gas to fuel power stations. The demand for electricity is still growing, and it is likely that additional nuclear power stations will be built. The emissions during the lifetime of a power station have been widely studied. This is sometimes called the cradle-to-the-grave approach. The approach looks at all possible sources for carbon dioxide emission, starting with the construction of the power station, through its operation and maintenance, to the decommissioning, and takes into account whether any recycling occurs or whether carbon dioxide processing takes place. Most authorities now agree this is the best method of measuring emissions for comparative purposes. There are many different types of power station in operation in the United Kingdom. These can be put into groups. Coal-fired, oil-fired or gas-fired all use fossil fuels. Those burning waste or wood do not use fossil fuels. Those considered to be renewable resources include the wood-fired station, hydroelectric schemes, solar and wind schemes. Geothermal energy can also be considered as renewable. Nuclear power stations use uranium ore, and this is not a renewable resource, though its supply poses no problems at present. While supplies of fossil fuels, such as gas and oil, are limited, the supply of coal is still plentiful. If energy demand were not to increase, then world supplies of coal would probably not be exhausted for over 100 years. How do these power stations stack up for carbon dioxide emissions? Note that we are now using our measurement of carbon dioxide emitted per kilowatt-hour of electricity produced. It is clear that producing electricity from any fossil fuel, coal, oil or gas, produces extremely large amounts of carbon dioxide, whilst other methods, including nuclear reactors, produce minimal amounts. Burning coal produces more carbon dioxide per unit of electricity than either oil or gas. The emissions will vary according to the age and efficiency of the generating plant, as this chart clearly shows. However, even considering the range, burning fossil fuels still produces far more carbon dioxide than other methods of generating electricity. Remember that indirect emissions include some running operations and the building and disposal phases in the life cycle of the generating plant. A European Commission report, the summary of which is shown in the chart, raises questions over efficiency, costs and reserves. Plants that burn fossil fuels have an efficiency of 50% or less. Even nuclear reactors only have an efficiency level of around 33%, and biomass plant also has low efficiency. In contrast, sustainable sources such as wind turbines and hydroelectric schemes have much higher efficiency. Planning should not overlook the dependency of plant using fossil fuels on both import of fuel and its sensitivity to price. As developing nations seek to expand their industry, the demand for these fuels is likely to increase. Currently, wind, water and solar plant are assessed as nil sensitivity on price. The proven reserves figures are subject to change when new reserves are discovered. However, it is important to remember that the cost of extraction from new reserves may well increase. The use of agricultural land raises many questions. Agricultural land is being lost to building projects, some is lost to desert from poor farming practices. The big question for the future is whether to use land for producing fuel or food. A significant amount of land in the USA is already used to produce ethanol for automobiles, and this has affected the price of foodstuffs and will continue to do so. Given the number of people who are suffering from malnutrition due to lack of food, There is also an ethical question here for those who care about the welfare of people in less developed countries. Keeping our focus on electricity generation. There are significant differences in emissions of carbon dioxide from different European countries. The low figures for France reflect the use of nuclear power to produce electricity. For Sweden, the production is dominated by nuclear power and hydroelectric schemes. Belgium also produces a significant amount using nuclear reactors. Not surprisingly, those countries with the highest emissions have the greatest dependency on fossil fuels. The low figures for efficiency for any plant burning a fossil fuel are linked to the need to heat a medium to drive turbines, leading to an enormous waste of energy as heat. Whilst wind turbines are considered to be efficient, they raise other questions. Many see wind turbines as unsightly, as a blot on the landscape, and a hazard to some wildlife. The sheer number that will be needed to reduce dependence on fossil fuels would mean large areas of the countryside becoming wind farms. Whenever a new wind farm is proposed, an environmental assessment is carried out, which is fairly rigorous in the United Kingdom and includes ecological, tourist and noise consideration. A major consideration when considering the merits of generating electricity from wind energy is the variability in wind speed and its effect on power output. As this chart shows, the output of electricity can vary from almost nothing to several thousand megawatts on a wind farm. This makes them useful to feed into a grid system, but also somewhat unreliable as a continuous source of power. Until recently, the use of geothermal energy was largely confined to countries such as Iceland, but research suggests that tapping into geothermal energy may become a possibility in the future. Even if this were not used for electricity production, the energy may be of use in other ways, such as heating, thus reducing demand for electricity. Solar energy can produce electricity even under cloud cover, but the amount does vary. In addition, solar energy is not available for 24 hours every day, so it is not a continuous supply. Hydroelectric schemes have focused on storage of water behind dams and then releasing the water to drive turbines and produce electricity. More interest is now shown in harnessing energy of water movement from tides, using turbines beneath the water. Whilst these require planning to avoid shipping routes, the advantage for many is that they are unlikely to produce the same outcry against planning permission when compared to wind turbines. If alternatives to fossil fuels are required, then nuclear power offers one possibility. However, even in the short term, there are potential problems. Nuclear power cannot be brought on board overnight, and the current capacity will fall considerably over the next decade. In contrast to France and Sweden, the United Kingdom has been reluctant to invest in nuclear power. Biomass plants are appearing, but raise questions over use of land. It seems probable their capacity will be limited for this reason, but they can still be important in helping to obtain energy from the disposal of other waste. The last 2 decades have seen an attempt to build gas-fired power stations as a cheap answer in the short term. In contrast, the longer-term solutions of nuclear power and wind turbines are more expensive. Using only construction costs to take decisions means that the longer-term effects of carbon dioxide emission are being ignored. However, when taking into consideration the lifetime of a plant, the cost of using natural gas is far from being cheap. The comparatively high cost of wind turbines and solar power have limited investment in these technologies. Coal is still seen as a cheap fuel for producing electricity, as the chart shows. A United States study completed around 2004 shows that wind and nuclear energy still remain cheap options when overall costs are considered. The figures also suggest that carbon sequestration processes could raise the cost of electricity to the consumer by around 50%. Carbon capture and sequestration is essentially a means of capturing and storing the carbon dioxide produced by burning fossil fuels. The storage would take place in exhausted oil, gas and coal fields. Some carbon sequestration plants are already in use. The potential for fields within the United Kingdom to store carbon dioxide is shown on this map. The process of carbon sequestration involves capturing carbon dioxide by making it combine with a carrier and then releasing the carbon dioxide in a stripper unit so that the carrier is continually being recycled. The United Kingdom imports much of the coal that is used in power stations, so there may be questions about dependency on overseas suppliers, as well as costing to reopen mines that were closed in the 1980s. Gas-fired power stations have a much greater dependency on imported fuel, and this will almost certainly influence future decisions about investment. There are very clear risks in having a significant amount of electricity generation depending on imports. This ends this podcast on electricity generation through different methods, including sustainable methods. We have also considered measurements in terms of emission and costing to include building and decommissioning. All these are important considerations for green economics. This podcast was brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.